welcome everyone to the October LINEA Webinar, which is on men, women, and the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents in 4 Brazilian cities. So as many of you know, LINEA is the learning initiative on norms, exploitation, and abuse. And we're based at the Gender, Violence, and Health Center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. The aim of LINEA is to foster the use of the social norms approach in preventing the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. And as part of the project, we organize regular hour-long webinars that cover different aspects of social norms, structural drivers, and the sexual exploitation and abuse of young people. So we're going to move right into the presentation. I'm very pleased today to introduce our presenter, Dr. Marcos Nascimento. Dr. Nascimento is the former executive director of Promundo, and he's currently a researcher at the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, where his research focuses on issues around gender, sexuality, violence, health, and human rights. So today he'll be discussing findings from a really in-depth study that explored community members' perceptions of the sexual exploitation of children and adolescents in Brazil. And the study used multiple research methods to produce some very rich findings. So we're really lucky to have him here today with us to delve into what they found. The presentation will last about 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. So with that, I'll hand things over to you, Marcos.
Well, first of all, I would say thank you to Rebecca and Michelle to organize this session, and thank you for inviting me. As Rebecca said, I'm Marcos Nascimento. I'm from Brazil. I used to be with Promundo. It's a local NGO with office in U.S., Portugal, and Rwanda for 11 years. And this is a presentation about the research that we carried out 3 years ago on men and women's perceptions about sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. Well, I said Promundo was founded in 1997, and it's a Brazilian NGO that works to promote gender equality and violence against women, children, and youth. Promundo is very well known because of the work with men and masculinities, so how to engage men with a masculinity perspective and a gender perspective to promote gender equality. So our presentation today, we try to promote further understanding of the practices and factors associated with sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. With support of our foundation, we carried out a qualitative and quantitative study to map and understand men and women's perceptions about this phenomena in 4 Brazilian cities, seeking to understand what extent the attitudes of men and women contribute to the perpetuation of sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. As we see, Brazil is the largest country in South America. We are approximately 200 million people living in Brazil, and we selected 4 different cities with different characteristics as well. In the north, we have Natal. Natal is very well known because of the beach, the tourism, and particularly prostitution and sex tourism. Itaperuna, it's a city located in Rio de Janeiro state. There is a big oil company there, so a lot of migrants came from the different parts of the country to work there. The other site is a favela. It's a shanty town here in Rio de Janeiro. It's a low-income community. Approximately, I would say, 100,000 people living there. It's a complex of 16 different communities. And in the south of Brazil, we have Florianopolis, mostly formed by white population, more conservative in terms of sexuality and gender issues. So we try to engage different perspectives and different places and different perspectives on our research. Just to give you a brief, very brief Brazilian context about children and adolescents. We make a difference between children and adolescents. We use the word children for 0 to 10 years old and adolescents from 10 to 18 years old. In some contexts, they use the same word children to cover the age from 0 to 18. But in the case of Brazil, there is a separation between this. We also have a very strong social movement around sex work in Brazil. So the prostitutes movement here is very strong since in the 90s because of the AIDS pandemic. And it's very necessary to make this distinction between prostitution and sexual exploitation. We do not use child prostitution, for example. We use sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. And we, most of the time, you see in the documents the word commercial sexual exploitation to highlight this aspect of the sexual exploitation that involves some kind of money, some kind of transactional situation. In terms of legislation, Brazil has signed the UN Convention of Children's Rights in 1989, and in 1990 we launched the Child and Adolescent Institute. It's a very advanced legislation. It's not implemented in the full potential of that. It's a very, very important legislation in terms of child and adolescent protection. And as you probably know, Brazil was the host for the World Cup last year, and the next year we will have the Olympic Games here in Rio de Janeiro. So this big sports event, there's some concern about that in terms of sexual exploitation of children and adolescents, and a lot of civil society organizations working on sexual exploitation. We're making some activities, some events around that to raise awareness about sexual exploitation of children and adolescents in the country. As I said, because of the Child and Adolescent Institute, children and adolescents are recognized as social actors and subject of rights. We see that the sexual exploitation is strongly connected to gender norms that shape interactions between men and women here in Brazil. And this type of violence results from a complex social system based on power inequalities between men and women, which imposes rigid restrictions not only on women and girls, but also on men and boys. We see that majority of victims of sexual exploitation in Brazil are female children and adolescents. And I'm not saying that we do not have boys or transgender people involved in the same situation. This is quantitative and qualitative research. So the qualitative research took place between April and September 2009 in Florianópolis, Itaperuna, and Natal. So we carried out focus groups and interviews with men and women between 18 and 59 years of age. This methodology permitted the exploration of how men and women navigate social spaces and times and how they demarcate social difference, and sometimes legitimize social spaces and power through gender norms. The quantitative research took place between September and December 2010 in those cities, Natal and Rio de Janeiro, with men between age of 24 59 and women between 18 and 59. There's some restrictions in terms of budget, so we carried out the quantitative research in those 2 cities and not in the 4 cities. Well, the quantitative study, the questionnaire covers 8 different parts. There includes characteristics of the population in terms of gender relations, attitudes about gender relations, behavior among family of origin, men and sexual relations, use internet for sexual pleasure, including sex worker and pornography, for example, and knowledge and participation in campaigns or programs related to sexual exploitation prevention. I didn't bring so many different details about the findings and results, but I would like to share with you some of findings, the main findings related to gender norms. So there is a general idea that men need more sex than women. And it happens because of biological determinants. So this idea of hormones or of instinct, that's why men need more sex than women. And one very interesting point is that pornography is part of the socializing of male adolescents in their sexual life. So all of adolescents, it's very common to use pornography, mostly through internet, but we do not see the same thing for girls. So girls do not have this permission to use pornography. It's something that considered immoral or not appropriated for girls, but it's totally appropriated and sterilized for boys. It's very interesting to see how men were deeply ambivalent when they spoke about prostitution or sex worker. All of them say that it's very common. Most of men at least once used to have sex relations with a sex worker, but on the other hand, they see something like underground or marginalized. One thing that is very strong in the research in terms of findings, it was that men engage other men as clients of transactional sex. So the peer influence has an important role in terms of having sex with prostitutes or sex workers. There is a recognition that sex work is a result of socioeconomic conditions, but on the other hand, many of our respondents said that women choose to engage in sex work. It's a matter of choice. It's not because they do not have any other opportunity or any other possibility in their lives, but men choose to be engaged in sex workers for a variety of reasons, to maintain their status or problems with drug use or drug abuse, or because they do not want to seek other kinds of work, or finally because they like it. In terms of sexual exploitation and related to children and adolescents, most of the respondents said that the families were blamed for creating an environment because they are negligent, because they did not take care of their children, and because of this negligence, they were engaged in sexual exploitation activities. At the same time, it's very interesting to see that the respondents seldom mention the underlying economic and social causes of sexual exploitation. So it's easier to blame the family than to think in terms of the structure, the social and economic structure of the country and of their regions. Most of our respondents believe there was no reasonable justification for adolescents between 12 and 14 years to be involved in sex work. They placed the responsibility on the men who violate those children, characterizing those men as sick. Frequently, they made parallels between children who are sexually exploited and those with whom they live, such as the sisters or Dora, emphasizing their revulsion to the practice. It's very interesting to see that it happens with the younger adolescents between 12 and 14 years old. As we see in the next slide, it's totally different when we are talking about adolescents between 15 and 17 years old. Most men and women, they have this perception if the adolescent girl was seen as physically mature in terms of development, they believe that they have relative autonomy to make a decision whether or not to engage in sex work. She is physically mature, she's seen as sexually available, and men completely abandon these comparisons with family members, as I said previously. So if you were talking about an adolescent between 12 and 14, okay, no, it's a child, it's not an adolescent, she's not an adolescent, she's a child, and she needs protection. But she is 15 or 16 years old, well, she's adult. She's not a child anymore, she's not an adolescent, and sometimes they refer to her as a prostitute or sex worker and not adolescent anymore. Another interesting aspect, there is no recognition of sexual exploitation of boys and trans people. When we are talking about sexual exploitation, men and women, they recognize the girls as vulnerable to sexual exploitation and sexual violence, but they don't recognize boys and trans people particularly the trans adolescents in this place. For trans people, the sex work seems as natural and expected as part of their lives. And for boys, there is a very strong moral judgment. Particularly if the client is a man. If the client is a woman, it's not considered sexual exploitation. It's something natural, and this young boy took advantage of this woman. So she is being exploited by the young boy, not the opposite. And I think it's a very interesting aspect of gender norms in our country. There are some recommendations for action based on our findings here. The issue of gender norms, and conception of hegemonic masculinity must be part of the discussion of understanding of the conditions of sexual exploitation of children and adolescents. We have seen most of the work focused, at least in our country, focused on child and adolescent in the situation of sexual exploitation. But we didn't know so much about the client. So this men who have sexual relations with adolescents. That's why one of our ideas to carry out this research is to highlight these aspects involved with the client. We think that it's imperative to call greater attention to sexual exploitation suffered by male adolescents and boys, keeping in mind the invisibility of the issue even within the study interventions regarding to sexual exploitation. Something that does not appear in the studies. We know that there are many adolescents and boys involved in sexual exploitation. They are underestimated. We don't have statistics around this. It's not in the same proportion of girls, but something that we need to learn more about that. Particularly male adolescents who identify themselves as gay or travestite or trans are much more vulnerable in terms of sexual violence and sexual exploitation, and with no specific protection towards those populations. Men who are engaged as caregivers and fathers show a strong revulsion for other men who sexually exploit children and could be a strong advocate on the issues. It's something that appeared in those quantitative studies when we did some statistics probes in terms of men who had sex with adolescents and adult men who had sex with adolescents and adult men who had not had sex with adolescents, and the fatherhood appeared as a mark of the difference. And given that peer influence as a strong determinant for men's paying for sex, it can also be a strong element for prevention. So this peer-to-peer education or trying to scale up the peer education in some of those communities, it seems a good practice to prevent sexual exploitation. And I think we finish here. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward hearing from you.
It's really interesting, and we already have some questions coming in. I see there are a couple of questions from Lopa. So the first question, was how easy or difficult is it for extending support to children in the context of divisions of children and adolescents?
Well, in terms of Brazilian legislation, we have this Child and Adolescent Institute that cover children plus adolescents. In terms of action and initiatives from civil society organizations and other government programs, it seems to be interesting to have this division because they have specificities in terms of development, for example. From 6 to 11 is completely different from 12 to 17. That's why we have this division in terms of programs and programmatic perspectives. But in terms of legislation, they are together. So they need protection, they need to have a life free of violence, the state has to take care of them if the family failed, etc., etc., etc. Can you read the second one, Rebecca, or?
So it was cutting in and out, but it sounds like you were asking, are for survivors of sexual exploitation, are services provided separately for children and for adolescents?
There are both possibilities. To have programs that include children and adolescents together, and there are some specific programs towards children and or towards adolescents. It depends on the region, it depends on the organization, it depends on the programmatic action plan of those organizations. But in terms of legal aspects and legislation, as I said before, they are considered as a whole group, children and adolescents.
And Patty Patesh had a couple of questions. Patty, would you like to unmute yourself to ask them directly?
The first question is whether the survey responses indicate any gender differences in attitudes about the role of the family as a cause of sexual exploitation of children.
Yes, there are some difference between women and men's perceptions about that. Women tend to be more protective of children and adolescents. They think that the family was negligent. That's why children and adolescents were involved in sexual exploitation. On the other hand, in terms of the men's perception, they think that an adolescent, when she is 15 or 14 years old, and depending on her appearance, they can choose this kind of situation. No, they are not blaming the family, as women do, but they think that those girls are making choices for their lives. There is another possibility, another type of work. If they are in the sexual exploitation context, it's because they wanted to. And there is a strong mark of age. If you are talking about adolescents, children, or adolescents until 12 years old, is something completely different to talking about adolescents 14, 15, or 16 years old. In terms of girls. In terms of boys, they don't recognize boys in a sexual exploitation situation. It's completely different.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And then my second question was whether the finding on male caregivers as a factor that could help prevent sexual exploitation of children, is that from the survey? Is that a statistically representative response?
Yes.
Yes, that's really interesting.
There is a statistical representation about that. Men who are fathers and have children with the same age, 14, 15, 16, they tend to be more protective of children. In those areas, we cannot affirm in the whole country, but in these two areas, Natal and Rio de Janeiro, it seems to be a difference in terms of approach, in terms of interaction.
Great, thank you.
There was another question that had been typed in about men caregivers. Lopa had asked if male caregivers who are recommended as strong advocates, how did the study assure that they themselves were not exploiting children sexually, or was that measured in any way, exploitation among caregivers?
Well, it's about their discourse about this. It does not make sure that they themselves were not sexually exploiting children, but in terms of perceptions and discourse, they are against this. So, and the reason that why they are against this is because they are fathers and they respect adolescents. But I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in the whole country. No, it's not a representative study from the whole country. No, there's only two different cities. But something that's interesting to think about, to engage men as fathers and caregivers can be somehow a good approach or an interesting approach in terms of violence prevention. In general, not only in sexual violence prevention, but in all kinds of gender-based violence prevention, for example. Other studies with men and gender-based violence show that being an active father, caregiver, etc., make a difference.
There was one other typed question, and then we'll move on to see if anyone else wants to ask a question directly. The other typed question asked, in your discussion with male clients about prostitution, was prostitution discussed in the context of exploitation?
Yes. It's very interesting to see that sometimes it's not clear for them the difference between prostitution and sexual exploitation. They consider all of this prostitution. And we see, and we can check it on the report, for example, that when we were trying to use the expression sexual exploitation, it didn't work. They don't understand what about we're saying, And we had to use prostitution with adolescents to make it clear for them. And it's interesting to see that, particularly in some cities like Itaperuna, for example, where we have this big oil company, lots of migrants from different parts of the country went to this job, got this job, and they are there in this city with no family for weeks or months without visiting their families, etc., etc. In the leisure time, to go to the red zone is their diversion. It's time to have fun, to drink alcohol, to have a beer, and to have sex. Particularly with men from 24, 39 years old. And one of the guys, for example, said, well, I'm not asking for ID for any girl in this place. And if she said she is 18, she is 18. No matter she is 15 or 16 or 17. So it's quite complicated depending on the context, That's why we cannot generalize the results for the whole country and for all types of situations.
Okay, and I'll ask a follow-up question on that. Did you have any sort of overall sense? So you asked folks both about buying sex and about exploitation of children. Did you have an overall sense of whether the perception is that adults are seeking sex with young people, or was it more one way or the other that they were seeking to purchase sex and they weren't very worried about the age of the person that they were going to buy it from?
Lots of possibilities. One possibility, to have sex with a young girl, it means something like to have more power and control of the situation. So we have a power issue. We have a youth issue. They feel that they are younger too, in terms of sexuality. I think the power issue probably is the key issue of the situation. To have sex with a young girl, it means that I am in the control of everything. I'm in charge of everything. She will do what I asked for, etc., etc. There is no negotiation, including, for example, condom use, or other sexual practices. And I think the power is one of the key issues of this relationship. Or to feel younger, it's something that appears in their discourse as well. It's completely different to have sex with 35 or 4-year-old sex worker than 18-year-old sex worker. It's completely different. There is a question here. How did the qualitative material contribute to the study findings? It was very important for us to have this qualitative piece. Both interviews and focus groups with men and women to establish the difference, the gender difference between men and women's perceptions around sexual exploitation, and to deeper some important aspects. Use of pornography, for example. It's completely widespread among men. All of them were sexually initiated somehow using pornography, videos, internet, magazines, etc., etc. And it's considered completely cultural and it's completely natural, not cultural, natural for them a boy use pornography. But it's not natural for young girls, for example. This idea that women, they do not like pornography or they do not access pornography. It's a male thing. It's one of example. The other one is about the body. No, adolescents, physically mature. It seems that she's available to have sex. It's not the same for women's perception. Women do not have the same perception that men in this case. So she is 15 years old, she is physically mature, so she's available for sex, and sometimes it happens, no matter the age. The perceptions of women is completely different. It tends to be more protective to adolescents and to be more protective to children in general.
And I had a question sort of following on from that. You talked about how there's a different conception between children and adolescents, but then also that physical maturity is a marker of adulthood. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how adolescence is seen. Like, at what stage is someone considered an adolescent and not an adult? And what does that mean for how they're perceived in terms of sexual readiness?
It's a very interesting question, and it brings many different aspects. For example, in Rio de Janeiro, in this favela, we can see, for example, a girl 15 or 16 years old, and they are considered adult by their community. They don't consider a 15 or 16-year-old as adolescent or someone who needs protection or someone who is in a developmental process. But if she is physically mature, she's an adult. That's why we have some kind of social status. It's completely different from the young girls. It makes us to think about, for example, sexual rights of adolescents. It's another big issue that we need to learn more and have a deeper discussion on that. What I'm saying about this is, for example, the connection between adolescents with the sugar daddies in the community. She's not engaged in sex work per se, but she accepts some gifts. No, it's a new clothes, it's jeans, or it's a mobile phone, whatever. And it's completely different of being, in terms of situation or in terms of context, completely different of being exploited in a gas station in the middle of road. It's completely different. So it's somehow we have to learn more about those phenomena and the naturalization of those phenomena in these communities.
The next question, which is typed out, is asking whether there was a particular age group of children who were more in demand.
I would say 14, 16, 17, those ages. Much more than the younger ones. No, this idea of physically mature, it seems to be so attractive in terms of interest from men to have sex with that.
So the next question is, would you have any recommendations? So this is looking at, rather than prevention, for recovery and reintegration of children based on your research.
There are some interesting initiatives here in Brazil, particularly in the north in Brazil, but in the south as well, but in the north in Brazil there are some very interesting initiatives towards education. So there is an educational center in Recife, for example, that it's so close to a very poor and violent community in Recife, and they try to engage the young girls in terms of educational approach. education in a broader sense, not only in terms of school-based education, but also in terms of cultural aspects. So they are engaged in dance classes, in music classes. They have a safe space to have conversations about their families or about their sexuality or about the exploitation per se, with social workers, with psychologists, with trainers. So they have some physical education, for example, sports. It's a very interesting experience in the north of the country. And there are some similar experience in Rio de Janeiro as well. Promundo has done a great work in terms of campaigns and in terms of safe space for those children, those vulnerable children.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask one sort of closing question for you, Dr. Nascimento, which is, I think a lot of the findings that you discussed, it seems like, could really form a basis for potential interventions around prevention. And I was just wondering if you could share what you see as some of the key findings that could contribute to interventions, or if you have sort of a sense of what we could kind of do with these findings in terms of prevention.
Brazil has a special moment right now with the sport events here in Brazil. World Cup last year, the Olympic Games next year. It's so interesting to see how different organizations from different parts of the country are trying to push a discussion on sexual exploitation of children, sex tourism, human trafficking. We are the country of soap operas, so we have a soap opera that included human trafficking and sexual exploitation in their story. So I think there are some very interesting possibilities and initiatives in a broader sense, for a broader society, like the soap operas, for example, or campaigns with the famous athletes here in Brazil, particularly men talking to men about sexual exploitation. So we have famous players, soccer players, here involved on some campaigns targeted to men. And I think there's a good approach in terms of raising awareness about sexual exploitation, children's rights, child protections, etc., etc. And I work from ecological perspective, so we need some specific initiatives, specific activities or actions in a community, but we also need in terms of the whole society. And I think the articulation or the connection between those is very helpful to fight against sexual exploitation.
Well, thank you so much. I think that this study is just unique, I think, in terms of really how you looked so carefully at social norms in the community, so what people are thinking around exploitation, even if they're not directly involved, and looking at ways that can influence it. So really, thank you for sharing your time and your experience, and I want to thank all of the participants as well for your discussion and questions. So thank you again, and we'll see you all next time.